Hey guys, Sean here. Welcome to the F1 Word and to a mid-week waffle. Some talk about the massive news yesterday that Daniel Ricciardo is coming back to F1 and it is goodbye to Nyck De Vries at AlphaTauri. Lots to get into today. I'm going to be joined by ESPN F1 editor Laurence in just a moment, Laurence Edmondson, to discuss all this. We'll try and look back at Silverstone if we get time, and we'll try and look ahead to Hungary and Belgium as well and take some of your questions. But as I'm sure you can appreciate, lots happened yesterday and we've had comments from Helmut Marko today. So much to discuss. Very, very interesting. And about time we had some silly season moves. Really, it's been quite quiet, hasn't it, on the driver market? And thank you to Sab Mariners fan for the super quick super chat. Says, forget where I saw it, but I remember someone saying Red Bull is using the rest of the season to compare Ricciardo and Tsunoda for 2024. We'll get into that, mate. Thank you so much for that early super chat. Massively appreciate your support. So let's try and press the right button and maybe it'll work for me. There we go. And say a very good evening to ESPN F1 editor Laurence Edmondson. Hello, Laurence. Thank you for joining us, mate. It's good to have you on. Lots to talk about thanks to yesterday.
Yeah, there is an awful lot to talk about. Well, thanks first of all for having me as well. I know we tried to do this after the Silverstone, basically on Sunday evening, but F1 are very particular about who can record where around the track, and there was no way of making it happen. But we've actually been kind of lucky, haven't we, as a result, because now we've got a real news story to get stuck into, lots of details behind the scenes, which I think are slowly coming out as we talk to more people. But yeah, it's an interesting story going into the last two races before the summer break.
Yeah, very lucky, actually. In some ways, better than talk about Silverstone. I'm sure nobody will agree with that statement, but why not? But yeah, I've heard they're quite funny about who can record and do what in the paddock. So I always say to people when they reach out, I understand it might be difficult to talk after the race, but we can always arrange something else. And it's like you say, it's worked out for us this week. And I'm guessing then you were on the ground at Silverstone. How was it? Was it a good weekend? The atmosphere looked pretty awesome.
It was very special, actually. I missed Austria and Canada. I'd had two races off, and coming back to Silverstone really was fantastic. There's so many people there, 160,000 on race day, which is big even for Silverstone. And despite that, from what I saw of the traffic, I tend to get there quite early and leave quite late. But from what I saw, the traffic wasn't too bad. So all the usual things that make Silverstone a bit of a drag over the weekend worked seamlessly. And yeah, it's still just such a special place to see a race. It has its critics, and I think a few of the criticisms are fair, but on the whole, just such a brilliant racetrack. So, yeah, I feel kind of reinvigorated having two races off and come back to such a cool venue.
Great. It's a great. I've been a couple of times. It's a great festival atmosphere, isn't there? With everything that goes on away from the racetrack, you get all the great action on track, and you get the F2 and the F3 and any other events they want to put on. But then you go back and you've got concerts on and comedians and bars and there's store. It's fantastic. I absolutely love it. So I would love to get next year if they could bring the prices down a little bit. That'd be lovely. Unlikely, but
the prices is the big thing, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
They've gone for this kind of airfare style pricing where more demand there is, the higher the tickets go, and it's hard to argue with it because the demand is there. They sold out. They had a bigger crowd than they've ever had before. But you don't want to get to a position where motorsport is unattainable, just to go and view motorsport. I mean, we all know it's so difficult to get into it and so expensive, but just to go and view, a Formula One race, it shouldn't be that it's, going to mean you're going to have to save up for several years to go. So I think that's something F1 has to keep an eye on. But really, I don't blame Silverstone for that. I blame Formula One and the general market for races and the likes of, I mean, we're really going off on a tangent here, but the likes of Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia coming in, offering 50 million a year. And, Silverstone has to compete to keep its place on what is already a packed calendar. So I think, but F1 does have to be careful because, it would be a real shame if people, especially, younger kids who want to go and watch motor racing for the first time. I know for me, it was when I first saw a Formula One car that fell in love with it. So, I think F1 has to keep an eye on that and make sure it's still accessible for the average person.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would say as well, before we quickly move on, I don't think, and I mean this with all due respect to anybody who can afford to go to the Paddock Club and things like that, I don't think you're going to get the crowd noise and the atmosphere that you get from people like me and people in the chat and just general F1 fans turning up on a general admission ticket or getting a grandstand seat. I don't think you'll get that atmosphere if it's all just full of extremely wealthy people there sipping champagne. No, honestly, no disrespect to them. They've got their money. They can do what they want with it. But I think you want it for the real fans, I guess, is what I'm saying. So that's my view on Silverstone. Hopefully prices will come down, but I doubt it.
You're absolutely right. And, there are venues that cater to that as well. I don't really have an issue if we have Miami as this super VIP event. And, but as long as, and Monaco's always been that way. Monaco has always been a race where you have to have a huge amount of money to even get a hotel room within, a 40, 50 kilometer radius. Of course, you can go and sit on the hill there, but still, that's always been an expensive event. But events like Silverstone, it's so important, like you say, for that atmosphere, for that love of the sport, that they remain accessible. So, yeah. Tangent to start it, but I think a very important point to make nonetheless.
Yeah, I think so. We'll move on though to the big news of the week. So before we get into discussing, so I've titled the stream "Pressure on Perez?" Because that is the most common comment that seemed to come up in the video that I put out yesterday. Thank you for your support on that, by the way, everybody. Really appreciate that. So I wanted to kind of discuss it a little bit today with Laurence. But before we get there, let's just have a quick reminder of what happened yesterday, I suppose. So in case you did somehow miss it, AlphaTauri confirmed on Tuesday afternoon that Daniel Ricciardo will replace Nyck De Vries at the team with immediate effect. The Aussie taking to the wheel for the first time at next week's Hungarian Grand Prix and will remain at the team on loan from Red Bull until the end of the season. I think that loan word is what has got people questioning Sergio Perez. This all happened, Laurence, really flipping quickly yesterday. Almost came out of nowhere. Were you surprised by the decision? I myself wasn't surprised by the decision, but I was certainly by the timing of it all. It seems to have come quite early and quite quickly.
I completely agree. And I think the biggest surprise is that Daniel is clearly so willing to go and take that seat, because my colleague Nate, we call him the Daniel Ricciardo whisperer because he's got very good contacts there. So I apologise you've ended up with me rather than him. It would be more appropriate of him. But anyway, and we've been keeping track of this story all year because it's been very clear that Daniel's there for a reason. I talked to him in Australia, and that was when he made it very, very clear that his aspiration was to get back on the grid, back to the very front of the grid eventually, but certainly back on the grid next year. Then Nate talked to him in Canada, and he said, the fairy tale ending would be to get back to Red Bull, and that's when we learned from people close to him that he was keen to take an AlphaTauri seat for next year. I feel even at that time, the messaging we were getting was that Daniel still has things he wants to do on his year off, and he's not quite ready to do it. But meanwhile, we had this pressure building up on Nyck De Vries, and that's been very clear for anyone who's followed the sport and has kept an eye on what Helmut Marko's been saying in the press, that there was this pressure just gathering on top of him. And ultimately, the fact that he's gone is maybe not a surprise, but the fact that, Ricciardo was there and ready and willing to replace him perhaps is. And you look at it and you think, well, if Red Bull had made up their mind on De Vries, and De Vries was on his way out, and then they turn around to Daniel and they say, do you want the drive? Or we've got this drive available. If he says no, it's probably going to be Liam Lawson who goes in, and then that puts a lot of pressure on Daniel to get back into that position. So I wonder whether Daniel was then in a position where he didn't really have much choice. And let's face it, if he is going to make a successful return, then he's got to probably deal with harder things. If he's going to go all the way to Red Bull, probably deal with harder things than joining mid-season with Yuki Tsunoda as his teammate. So I think he kind of had to do it in the end. But yeah, you're right. It was a surprise that it came about so quickly. But we did know that Red Bull were paying particular attention to Daniel's performance at the Pirelli tyre test, and that seemed to be the thing that, officially anyway, tipped it over the edge.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean this sort of in a disrespectful way, but do you think there's with Ricciardo on this one, there's an element of, given how big a hit his stock took last year, a little bit of an element of beggars can't be choosers, in that if you want to come back to the grid, then you're going to have to accept that to start with, you're going to have to take a step back to an AlphaTauri or a lower down team, because last year he really didn't want to take that step back, did he? He'd rather have taken the year out.
Yeah, I think where he was leaving McLaren, being beaten so comprehensively by Lando Norris, did leave him in a difficult position. And you're right, if he'd wanted to, he could have entered negotiations with Haas, definitely, with Williams as well, and probably with AlphaTauri. So, all of those were potential options. But I think what he wasn't sure about at that stage was whether F1 was right for him at all. He'd taken such a battering. I think his confidence was so low that the thought of then changing teams, going into a new team, doing it all over again from Bahrain and potentially facing a similar situation was just too much for him to sign up to. Reality is that he's gone through these first 10 races not on the grid. He's seen it all pan out, and as I said, very early on it became very clear to him, I think, and he wasn't afraid of telling everyone else that he really wanted to be back in F1. So I think that time away, albeit short, has added clarity in his mind over what he wants to do. And then when the opportunity comes up, if that is really what you want to do, you can't turn it down. So I think that's the way it's all come together. And it seems like he's had a boost in confidence from what he's been able to do in the Red Bull simulator. And again, it seems from the tyre test yesterday, but very different circumstances, testing tyres with a Pirelli run plan at Silverstone, having the whole track to yourself, to getting into a brand new car in Hungary and making it happen. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens over the course of the next race weekend.
Yeah, and I think I said yesterday as well that on De Vries, and I'm kind of glad you said that this has been good for a while, because I thought I was going a little bit crazy. But this whole thing with De Vries just had an air of inevitability about it for me, because, and it's kind of been confirmed a little bit, or confirmed that for me a little bit with what Marco has said today. Help Marco. He said, in quotes with Dutch newspaper De Telegraaf, apologies for butchering that, says, we contracted Nyck because he performed great at Monza last year. We expected him to be at least equal to Tsunoda this year, but that was not the case. Actually, he was always 0.3 slower than Yuki. We saw no improvement. We had to do something. Why wait and why do that? Try that again. Why wait and what do 2 more races matter if you don't see any improvement? Nyck is a very nice guy, but the speed just wasn't there. So sort of confirmation there from Helmut Marko that they signed him based on a race in Monza in a Williams that was always going to go well at Monza. A fantastic performance from De Vries all weekend. He absolutely deserved every bit of credit he got for that, and I can understand why teams were looking at him. But based on one weekend, how can I word this? Are you sort of asking for trouble a little bit if you're AlphaTauri in that situation? If you're taking a driver based on one performance in a Williams on a track where that Williams was always going to go well, is that a little bit unfair? Because I know De Vries has got a lot behind him with his World Championship in Formula E and what he achieved in his junior career as well, and what he's done elsewhere. So that must have, I guess the question I'm asking is that there must have been more to this than just he did well at Monza, let's sign him, or was it they didn't have many options because Pierre Gasly was like, I want to go, guys, I've had enough, I want to go to Alpine?
Yeah, we have to put ourselves back in the reality of mid-2022 when Fernando signed to leave to go to Aston from Alpine, creating a space there. And Pierre still had a year left on his contract at AlphaTauri this year, and made quite clear that he wanted to get out of it because, I think it was clear to everyone, okay, he had that win during COVID at Monza with AlphaTauri. But other than that, it was quite clear that Pierre's career wasn't going anywhere at Red Bull, and Red Bull have made it kind of clear to him that he was never going to get back up into the top team. So that was a relationship which always seemed like it was going towards an exit somehow. Then, of course, is around the time of the Dutch Grand Prix, Marco said they wanted Colton Herta. That was their man. So, at that point, De Vries hadn't had his kind of miracle race, if you want to call it that, at Monza. And so that was the plan they had. Then the FIA made very clear that they would not bend any rules to allow Herta to get a super license because he wasn't going to end up with enough points at the end of the year. And so they had to reframe it, look again. As we mentioned earlier, perhaps Daniel was going to be an option because we knew by that point that he was on his way out of McLaren. But Daniel didn't want to, at that point, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, make a step backwards. And so they were getting, there were very few options. I suppose Lawson was an option as well. De Vries kind of, I think they felt was worth a punt. But it did always seem to be in a kind of seat warmer capacity, unless he did something very special, which I think was always going to be tricky, given that, despite being a 28-year-old rookie, he was still a rookie coming in. But unless he did something very special, then it was always going to be tricky. Now, my opinion, personally, is that I don't think De Vries has performed anywhere near badly enough to be kicked out midway through the year. I know Marco said 0.3 seconds off. And I think it depends how you calculate it, really, because if Baku was a complete disaster for him. He crashed in the sprint qualifying, I think, and then there was a red flag in proper qualifying, or perhaps the other way around, can't quite remember. Anyway, but if you remove that from his qualifying results and you look at the pure qualifying pace between the two, and you look at, you match Q1 for Q1 and stuff like that, it's more like 0.2.5 seconds is the figure that I came on. And so, it's not terrible. That's not a long way off. But then you also have to consider how good is Yuki Tsunoda. And I think Tsunoda's made a big step this year, but mainly in consistency. I'm not sure if he's made a huge step in pace. So, if you think, well, you're 0.2 of a second off, or 0.3 of a second if you take Marco's numbers, which perhaps are more accurate, he's got more data, off Yuki, then, is that ever going to turn around in time for AlphaTauri to make a decision? And I think it had already become clear around the time of Canada that Daniel was very keen on AlphaTauri for next year, and AlphaTauri were very keen on Daniel for next year. So, it comes to a point where you think, well, maybe actually the best thing for the team, obviously not for Nyck, but for the team, is to make the change. So I guess that's the logic behind it. But it does seem brutal, doesn't it? It really does seem brutal.
Yeah, a lot of people said yesterday, this is, and I said it as well in my video, that it's a ruthless sport, and Red Bull can be more ruthless than most teams when it comes to their drivers. But I think from the human side, I think a lot of people would agree. You still sort of go, oh, that's a shame. It's a shame for him that he couldn't turn it around or couldn't prove to them that he was the driver to deliver for that team. So I do feel for him on a human level. From a sporting level, I sort of agree with what Marco's saying about not a massive amount of improvement, but at the same time, I was pondering this last night. What improvement was he expecting in just 10 races around? When you look at some of the tracks we went to as well, and then the sprint weekends, and a bit stop-start with China not happening, and Imola getting called off, 10 races doesn't feel like a lot. But if he was there just to plug a gap because they couldn't find a better option, then that's what I mean about the air of inevitability. This was always going to happen as soon as Ricciardo or somebody else became available. So I do feel for him. I absolutely do. But it's not, the decision isn't a great surprise. I'm just very surprised it's happened so quickly. I thought he'd get a year max, is how I felt, a season at most, before they made the change. But sort of on Ricciardo, before we get onto the Perez stuff, there are a couple of things that I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, of course, Laurence, you've got more information than I have, and more sources and things, but I wonder if these are factors as well. Next season, AlphaTauri's goal, as far as the rules will allow, is to move towards Red Bull's philosophy and share what they can. So having a driver who's been working with Red Bull for the last 10 races and for much of this year is going to be a benefit to them. His experience will be a benefit as well in moving all that sort of stuff over, and within the team generally. He knows the team as well. But also, they're rebranding, aren't they, next season? So is a driver like Daniel Ricciardo, with respect to De Vries, a much more marketable guy if you're relaunching effectively your team? Is this a marketing thing as well as an experience thing, as well as a De Vries performance thing? Kind of like the perfect storm for Ricciardo, but not so much for Nyck, obviously.
Yeah, I think those are very good observations and absolutely correct. I mean, if Daniel can rediscover some of his form that he had from his Renault and Red Bull days, then you've got a driver who I think pretty much undoubtedly is better than Nyck De Vries. I don't think there's much of an argument the other way. And then, of course, you have this arguably the most marketable driver in Formula One, certainly up there in the top 5 or so. And if success comes with it, then he's definitely up there. So, yeah, I think those were definitely considerations, and they're always considerations when teams are looking at drivers. And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. Those are two things which make a big difference, and it will be interesting to see how Daniel gets on with the AlphaTauri. This big issue with the McLaren was not having the confidence when he turned into corners, and just not having it stick in the way that he wanted to, that he was used to. I'm not sure the AlphaTauri is a massive step up, but they do. It seems to be more of kind of mid-corner understeer, and kind of issues around there that the car's really struggling with. So perhaps he can find a way to drive around that a little bit more than he could the McLaren, and there's probably a little bit of pressure as well, a little bit less pressure, sorry, as well, because going up against Yuki Tsunoda versus going up against Lando Norris, I think those are two different classes of driver. Not to say that Tsunoda will never get there, but I think Norris is certainly in a class above. So I think it does make sense on a lot of levels. And if you look at it purely from a logical point of view, if Daniel is available and you've got a situation, you can get Nick out of the contract. If you look at it, just purely on upsides versus downsides of those two drivers, as harsh as it seems, Daniel is always going to win out, isn't he? So it will be interesting to see. Yeah, I think just whether he can manage the switch of car mid-season. I think it's sometimes underestimated how difficult that can be to move from one team to another, or one car to another, or into a car midway through the year with minimal testing. But hopefully he'll get a bit more leeway than Nyck De Vries did. And I think realistically it is a look to next year as well, giving him a bit of a run up so that next year he can perform at his best.
I'm just having a look at chat, see if anyone's saying anything worth mentioning at this stage. I am going to come to chat for questions in a bit, and we'll take your points as well, but there's so much happened yesterday, so much is still happening, so I'll come to your comments in a bit. But just before we get to the Perez stuff, I will just mention these Marco comments on Ricciardo. He said Ricciardo's lap times were competitive during the tyre test on 3 different tyre sets. If Ricciardo hadn't had the speed, we would have needed to consider something else. I assume that something else would have been Liam Lawson, although I think I saw some comments before I went live, I can't tell you where they're from, suggesting that maybe Marco didn't want to upset Liam Lawson's development mid-season because he's very much part of their plans for the future. He then goes on to say AlphaTauri is not in a good position right now, so we had to do something to change that. That often happens after a driver change, and Ricciardo brings new energy to the team. We also have to see first how Ricciardo compares to Tsunoda. I think Yuki is underestimated by many people. Absolutely agree. The AlphaTauri is not the easiest car to drive, but Yuki has proven that it is possible to get good results. So how Marco's been on a good old waffle today with some information for us. But yeah, just very quickly, Laurence, would you have assumed that there's something else would be someone like a Lawson? I can't think of anything else.
That would be the only other option at this stage. And I'm sure if you offered it to Liam and you said, look, here's an AlphaTauri drive from Hungary onwards, he would have absolutely taken it, even though his Super Formula campaign is going quite well. He's second at the moment. But I think there is a certain logic, which is not always applied to Red Bull's driver decisions, of letting drivers, see out seasons and mature properly in the position that they're in before making a snap decision. So I think that was probably part of it as well, as that Daniel is in a position where he can jump into a car mid-season. Liam Lawson, complete and utter F1 rookie coming in, 0 testing, that would be really, really tough. So I think really to make this move work of getting rid of De Vries, it had to be Daniel coming in. And I think it would have been probably a bit too much to ask of Lawson. But it's not to say Lawson isn't going to be a candidate going forward. And Red Bull like to have options. They like to have lots of drivers contracted, and they like to swap them around mid-season. It's not the first time we've seen this, of course. We've seen it with Kvyat twice, I think. He even came back, whichever year it was, he got knocked out of Toro Rosso and came back for Austin for one race. Brendan Hartley and Sainz moving over to Renault. Like there's so many weird things that happen within the Red Bull system where they loan each other and so on. And the other thing to remember is that when you're an AlphaTauri driver, you're signed to a Red Bull contract. So they are all Red Bull drivers, which means that at any one point, Red Bull can decide how they mix and match them. Of course, we saw that with Kvyat and Verstappen in 2016, things like that. So, that is just the nature of the Red Bull system. But yeah, I don't think anyone other than Ricciardo within their pool would have been ready to take on this challenge. So that makes sense. And it's interesting, this lap time thing as well, because it initially came out as it's good enough for the front row. And then the time which has kind of slowly worked well. We don't get the official timings for Pirelli tyre testing because it's all controlled by Pirelli. We're not actually allowed to be there either, so you're not allowed to go there and watch unless you get specially invited. And it seems that his lap time was a 1:27.415. which is good, but it's not a front row lap time for what it's worth. It's about 7 tenths off Max's pole position and would have put him 8th on the grid, I think, at Silverstone. So, not by no means terrible. It's a good competitive ballpark lap time. It is better than 15th, but it was also set on an empty track, with God knows how many attempts at it, and low fuel, and also very different tyres, very different track conditions. So there's a number of reasons why you cannot read anything into it. But I think everyone got super excited about the lap time, and then less so. But I think also a one-off flying lap is not where Red Bull would have been looking. They would have been looking at what he was able to do over stint, how he was able to manage the tyres, where that stacks up, relative to what they expect. Again, their next year's tyres, their tyres that don't need blankets, so it is very, very different. But they would have got an idea of what Daniel was able to do, and so it seemed to be that Christian called up Helmut and said, "Look, things are looking quite good." Helmut then called up Christian later that day and said, "Right, I've told Nyck that he's out, and let's bring Daniel in." So, yeah, it did happen pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I guess, like I say, and as Marco said, that if they already are pretty confident they're going to be getting rid of De Vries, why prolong the inevitable? Why drag him through that? Why drag the team through that? If you're going to make the change, do it quickly and get it done, rather than somebody made that point in the comments yesterday to me. I thought that's an excellent way of looking at it. If you're changing that driver at the summer break, why keep him in for 2 races? If the decision's been made, there's just no point. So it's always just happened so quickly and kind of came out of nowhere. But I think Nate said in his article, Nate Saunders, your colleague, said that I think it was him that kind of all of the leaks from the Netherlands sort of forced Red Bull's hand a little bit, and they had to then make the announcement early. I think they wanted to do it later in the week, didn't they?
So the story got out there quite quickly. We're not entirely sure where it got, or who leaked it, but it certainly appeared in a bunch of Dutch articles. So I think once that's out there, there really is no point in dragging it out further. The press release was very short. Nyck De Vries sadly didn't get too much of a mention. I think it's only in Franz Tost quotes. So I think there's a bit of that, but this always happens in F1. A story like that, when you've got one driver being booted out in fairly nasty circumstances, it's very likely that it's going to leak from that side, and then force the hand. And we've seen that multiple times before. Force the hand of the PR people to get an announcement out and take control of the story. So I think that's what they're going to do. I mean, look, I see the logic of saying that if you're going to make a call, or if Nyck stays in numbers anyway, do it early. But I'm sure Nyck would have seen it the other way. He would love to add 2 more chances at trying to beat Yuki. And, I think it's always so multifaceted that the reasons for poor performances in F1, and especially further down the grid, because we don't often pay enough attention to it, really, because we're so fixated on what's going on at the front, and you'll sometimes miss the reasons why a driver, it could be things completely out of their hands, and it won't get reported on so much because quite naturally, we're focused on what's going on at the front. So I'm sure if you sat down with Nyck now, there'd be a whole bunch of reasons why he was incredibly unlucky through the year. But Red Bull and AlphaTauri would have been aware of that as well, and ultimately it's their choice, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and they're not afraid to make those changes, are they, if they need to, or they feel they need to. So, like I said, I've been here before, and actually, as Kevin N said in chat, says Red Bull got rid of Albon and Gasly, and they're doing just fine. So, hopefully, De Vries finds something somewhere. Zakar in chat also says Red Bull also have all the sim data on every driver to compare. So that's a very good point to make there, that they're not just basing it on the tyre test itself necessarily. There'll be other things as well, won't there, and comparisons there. And Gary says, how does the F1 word only have 127,000 subscribers? Great question. Rectify that, Gary. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and leave a like. That was a great transition, Laurence. You'll love that.
Fantastic. Yeah.
And leave a like as well. Really appreciate the support. I will come to you more in chat for questions shortly, but I need to get onto this Checo thing, because there's just so much to discuss, and I wanted to get through that one as well. So, as I said a couple of times, the most common comment I got and saw yesterday was that this is all about Red Bull gauging or benchmarking Ricciardo against Perez, and maybe this big ploy to get Ricciardo back in that Red Bull for as early as 2024. In fact, some people seem to be talking like it could happen sooner than that, which I'm not at all sure on. It's got to be a factor somewhere. and it's got to be a factor to a point. But the official line from Red Bull, and Christian Horner said very similar, but Helmut Marko said today, Checo is second in the World Championship, so it would make no sense to want to get rid of him now. Also at Silverstone, his race was good, but he needs to improve in qualifying. So, and yes, before anyone says it in chat, I know sometimes what team principals and team bosses say and what they do can be two different things. We've learned that the hard way before. I'm not going to give you the example about Gasly and Albon being swapped, but you'll know what I'm talking about. So they're not. The official line is that that's not the case. Where do you stand on this, Laurence? My honest view is that I think it's far more likely Checo will still be in that seat next season, regardless of what Ricciardo does, than he's going to be out, unless he has an absolutely horrendous rest of the season and his qualifying form then turns into bad race form as well. I don't think Checo is a bad second driver to have in that team, and I'd be surprised if they're looking to move him out anytime soon. Certainly not in the next few races, as some people are talking about. That's crazy, but probably not even for next year. Do you think this could be maybe more about 2025 rather than 2024?
Well, Daniel, when he's talked about it recently, said that, it's become clear anyway from people around Daniel that AlphaTauri was the target for next year, and then Bull was the target after that, which of course would be the end of Checo's contract. Now, it does seem like all of that has been accelerated now. So, I think it's absolutely extra pressure on Checo. No one can, I think, argue otherwise on that. Having a driver of Daniel's caliber in a team where there's so much flexibility to switch drivers around, it is absolutely extra pressure. But I like you would be incredibly surprised if they do something this year, not least because it just doesn't really seem to make sense for anyone. Again, it's like added pressure on Daniel, another change to another car, and I just can't see it happening. But for next year, potentially, because Red Bull at the moment have got themselves into a brilliant position through sheer hard work and technical expertise, where Max Verstappen is basically leading the construct. He's second in the Constructors' Championship himself, behind the combination of Red Bull drivers. So, look, I don't know. I just can't see a situation where this year it would change. But yeah, next year it's a possibility, because if Ferrari and Mercedes and Aston Martin and perhaps even McLaren start to make serious gains towards the end of this year, close the gap, then Red Bull have got to keep half an eye on where they'll be. And if you look at Mercedes, they've got two very, very good drivers, capable of really maximising the potential each race weekend. And I would say actually the driver lineups, Ferrari, McLaren, and Mercedes are probably all stronger as a combination than Verstappen and Perez. Obviously not because of Verstappen, but because of Perez. So it's got to be a factor, if the other teams start to close in. But Daniel's got to perform as well. I don't think there's a guarantee that Daniel gets in the AlphaTauri and blows Yuki away at all. So if he can't prove himself to be a genuinely better a better option than Checo, then you won't get that drive. So there's a lot to play out, and I actually believe Christian and Helmut when they say that no decision has been made on that yet. And if you can look at Checo's performances and his average lap time gap to Max in qualifying, and it's not good, but then he is up against Max Verstappen, who I think is he really is on top form at the moment, and obviously one of the best drivers in F1.
It's the Hamilton Bottas argument again for me. I was quite critical of Bottas at times, but a lot of people as well were sort of like, well, he's nowhere near Hamilton. You're like, yeah, but I know Bottas was probably closer to Hamilton than Perez is to Verstappen, but you're talking about Bottas versus a generational talent. You're talking about Perez versus a generational talent. Perez is a fantastic driver. I think the guy's great. And I don't even think, his qualifying's not been great, but I think there have been, I'm not defending him as such, but there have been circumstances there. The weather's been a bit mixed and things like that. And he's been caught out by, been left at the end of the pit lane for 3 hours on Saturday at Silverstone, for example. Mistakes by the team have been made. But I sort of go to, I think it gets forgotten as well that in Austria, in the sprint qualifying session, he did qualify on the front row. So I think he still has the pace there. I don't think he's lost that. And as Marco has said, that he's sort of turning it around on a Sunday. There's no denying his qualifying run is very poor, and you should not be getting knocked out of Q1 and Q2 in what is all but a championship-winning Red Bull now. But I think to be making, and I know the team aren't, but for people to be making the suggestion that he's going to get the chop based on the last 4 races, when one of those includes a third place recovery in Austria, and he was very good last year for Red Bull. Probably could have done better, but was very good for his first season with them in that car rather than first season with them. You know what I mean? I think it's a little bit harsh. I don't think he's been that horrendously bad. I think the way people are talking sometimes, it's like he's been finishing 11th every race and qualifying at the back of the grid, and he's not. He's doing well to turn it around. So I guess the point I'm making, in a really waffly roundabout way, is if he sorts his qualifying out, he's probably going to be second, third, right up there with Max Verstappen on the podium every weekend. So, and he was doing it at the start of the season, wasn't he? So it's just he's hit a dip in form, and I don't think that's necessarily an unusual thing. Even the best drivers hit a dip in form from time to time. All right, fine, it might only be 1 or 2 races in the cases of, say, a Max Verstappen or a Lewis Hamilton or a Michael Schumacher, but they do dip. So I think he deserves a little bit of slack there. So the idea that they're going to, certainly this notion they're going to drop him at some point very soon is crazy to me, and I'm just not convinced about the rumours for next season at all. Unless, of course, as a couple of people have said in chat, what happens if Daniel Ricciardo hops in that car in Hungary and beats Sergio Perez in a much slower AlphaTauri, at which point let's have the conversation again if he does that on consecutive weekends before the summer break, because maybe there is an issue there for Perez. But I don't know what you've heard, Laurence. There was some talk at the weekend. In fact, Sergio Perez's quote was something along the lines, I forgot to write it down, something along the lines of the bad weather, the wet conditions and mixed conditions, I guess, exacerbate his problems with the car at the moment. What's the word around how Red Bull has developed that? Because there are some rumours that perhaps they're leaning more towards Max Verstappen with development, or is it just, do you think, a dip in form? Because I will defend Red Bull if they are developing the car towards Verstappen, because he's winning the championship. You're going to side with your number one driver, but I'm not sure how much of that is just maybe Checo looking for a reason, if that makes sense.
I think what Red Bull do, and they've done this consistently, and this is a big factor in the struggles Max's teammates have had, is that they develop absolutely the fastest car, theoretically. And what Max can do is take that theoretical lap time and get incredibly close to it or on it. And he can do it through immense talent, an ability to have the rear of the car, slipping and sliding around on corner entry, corner exit, everywhere it seems. So even as the car gets trickier to drive, as long as the lap times come out of it the other end, Max can deal with it. Other drivers who perhaps don't quite have the level of talent and natural ability struggle. And then when it gets even more marginal, and with conditions and outside factors, then it all plays against them. But I mean, so I think that's a factor, absolutely. But if the car is faster in the wind tunnel, if it's faster, through all their simulations, and Max can deal with the car being like that, then of course they're going to bring the upgrades, and if the other driver struggles to get the same from it, then, it's kind of tough luck, but, they are looking to have the fastest car they possibly can. So I think that's a factor to it. But Checo has definitely taken a big hit in confidence, and I think, it stems back to that Monaco Q1 exit, silly mistake that even he couldn't explain afterwards, just taking way too much speed into the corner. And that was a circuit where, going into that weekend, I think most of us kind of still felt that it would be very remarkable if Checo came out as the champion at the end of this year. But, there was still a possibility. And, Miami had been close, and Max had beaten him. So, that obviously didn't help. But Checo was looking fairly solid up to that point. And then, the Monaco mistake happened, then the Spain mistake, then, things like Canada, where he was, the conditions were bad, but Max was out on those intermediates as well and set, the second fastest time out there. The performance was there in the car. It's just that Checo wasn't able to access it. And so much of it is marginal stuff, especially when the conditions are that bit cooler, getting the right tyre temperature in them, but then obviously not overheating them too much by the end of the lap. And all of those little things, that big balancing act, that every great qualifying lap requires. It seems that Checo's knocking confidence has meant that he's really struggled to do that. And his race performances they have been good. They have been okay. I don't think they've been spectacular because let's not forget, Max had that drive shaft failure in Saudi, and I know Saudi is a track where you can overtake, but then got himself back up to second place. He had Miami where he got caught out by the red flag caused by Leclerc's accident. And okay, that was partly his own fault for not setting a banker lap earlier in the session, but then came back through and won the race. So look at it and you think, well, what Max has been able to do with that car when he's been out of position is very different to what Checo's been able to do. And then also some of the winning margins Max has had. If you apply that pace, plus imagine a fair bit in hand that he didn't have to access, you think, well, actually Checo probably should have got some better results even from the poor qualifyings he's had. So it's all pressure building up. But, like I said earlier about Nyck, I'm sure, when we do talk to Checo, that there are lots of reasons that there's lots of kind of some misfortune along the way. But the difference is between the very best, so Max Verstappen, and the very good, which is where I'd class Perez, is the ability to make sure it happens one way or another. You have luck, sure, but you also make your own luck by just being consistently on it all the time, taking the opportunities when they're there, not going over track limits 3 times in Q2 in Austria, things like that the top drivers just don't do. So yeah, I think that's where Checo is. But in terms of them developing the car towards Max, well, yes, but I think that's just because they're developing the fastest car they can.
Yeah, I think that's all very fair. And I couldn't shake the feeling on Sunday. I didn't say it on the stream, and I wish I had, but I couldn't shake the feeling on Sunday that even though Silverstone's not the easiest track to overtake on, contrary to what a lot of people think, it's a tricky track to overtake on. I still think Verstappen, had he qualified 15th on the grid, would have been on the podium on Sunday. And I guess that's the point you're making, is it the difference between a great driver and a very good driver. And I'm a big defender of Sergio Perez. I always have on this channel, always defended him because I think he gets a lot of stick, and I think it's often justified. I think, the going back a little bit, everything with Ocon at Force India was a little bit unnecessary, and I think he got a little bit rattled by Ocon at the time I said it, and I think he's made mistakes, but I think he's definitely better than a lot of people give him credit for. And I think if he can recapture anything like that early season form, sort of going forward now, all of this, and I guess this is the point, isn't it? If he performs, all of these rumours disappear. Because if he's performing, then there's no reason to even look at another driver. He's contracted for next year. Doesn't matter what Ricciardo's doing. If Perez is second, third place at worst every single race with Max Verstappen, you'd have to assume probably winning most, if not all, the remaining races. So I think that's the, Perez said he's not bothered about the speculation about his future, but ultimately the best way for him to stop that speculation is to perform, and that starts with his Saturday. So I'm really excited for Hungary for so many reasons, which is weird because I never get excited for Hungary, but I am this year because obviously Ricciardo's back and I want to see what Perez can do. But if he gets to Hungary, starts on the front row with Max, finishes second, or even wins the race, who knows, in Budapest, then all of a sudden everyone's going to go a little bit more quiet and go, well, actually, let's just see where he ends up. But it's kind of, a lot of people don't like speculation, but it's a natural thing in Formula One. It happens all the time. But when you have a big change like this and such a big name in Daniel Ricciardo coming back, that speculation is inevitable. So I hope Checo's able, and he seems like the kind of guy that can, but I hope he's able to sort of shut all that noise out and just focus on what he needs to do and find that form again, because he's certainly much better than 15th on the grid, and that car absolutely is much better than 15th on the grid. I said it on Sunday, I've said it at the last few races, it's unacceptable that car isn't in Q3 every weekend, whatever the excuse. Unless there's been some kind of mechanical problem, that car should be minimum Q3 every single weekend. So just unbelievable what they're doing this season, isn't it, really? Just on a side note, it's blows me away.
It really is, but it does put pressure on that second driver, because you were saying there. I mean, I remember I had an interview with AlphaTauri last year, and we got talking to about I got talking to him about 2018, and he considers that to be absolutely his worst season. And it's this realization as a driver, all of a sudden, you go through your whole career, your whole life, believing, pretty much every racing driver this is the case, that you are, or you could be, fastest and best driver out there, and you could be a world champion the moment you get your hands a car that's capable of delivering it. And it's so easy for drivers lower down the grid to say, well, if the car was there, I'd be fighting for a championship alongside Max and all the rest of it. But the reality when you get there and you are being comprehensively beaten by a teammate, be it Hamilton in Bottas's case or Verstappen in Checo's case, it really is kind of soul destroying for them. And Valtteri talked about this moment at the end of 2018, and he still had a contract for next year because they did it 1 year by 1 year when he was at Mercedes, which never really helped. But he went for a walk in the woods in Finland, and he was on the verge of picking up the phone and calling Toto and saying, look, I'm not coming back next year. You have to find someone else. And he eventually just kind of bought himself thinking that and said, no, actually, you've got the best job in the world. You're a racing driver. And he came back, and the start of 2019 was actually quite strong. I mean, didn't win a championship, of course, but, it was then one of his slightly better years. So, it does take a toll. And I have noticed with Checo, again, you reminded me, talk about his Force India days, and in media sessions, he'd kind of hang around and chat to us a bit more. And so, you'd do your normal questions, and then he'd turn off the dictaphones and he'd ask us questions at the end of it. And, he just seemed to be, in a much better mood about things. And I think quite rightly at the time was, a very highly rated driver. And we all thought, if anything, he's probably a bit underrated. But I don't see the same Checo now as he's at Red Bull. We went to the launch event, and it was almost like he didn't want to be there earlier this year, which was sad to see. And that was before the season had even started. But, I don't know whether that's the extra pressure, knowing that the season was about to start and he had to make a very strong start. And I think we saw flashes of the kind of real Checo, the normal Checo, when the season did go quite well and he got those 2 early victories in Saudi and Baku, and it kind of looked like, oh, maybe there is something that he can build momentum with. But yeah, it's kind of gone the other way now. But a shame, because he's a lovely guy, and I think actually a very solid racing driver in the right circumstances. So it is just that pressure of going up against the very, very best.
That's all interesting. I didn't really notice that with the. But then I'm a fan that sits at home and watches it, so I don't really get the insight that you guys get. But I didn't really notice that with him at the launch. That's interesting. So I'll bear that in mind. I'll be watching for that now every weekend. Is he all right? What's going on? Thank you for that. Jamie says you would at least want some consistency, though. Checo, I feel like his highs are closer to Valtteri, but his lows are even worse. That's what Jamie's saying in chat. Sab Mariners fan says developing the car towards Max shouldn't be used as a defence when Checo qualifies 16th in one of the best cars ever. That's a fair point as well. A few people asking about Charles Leclerc at Red Bull. I've seen all sorts of rumours about Norris and there was another one as well. I think Leclerc I've just mentioned, but we'll do that probably another day. If there is any kind of movement at Red Bull, we'll see what happens. Regardless of pace, Checo never struck me as a Red Bull type driver. He just doesn't have a Red Bull personality, says P1. Great name. It took me a second to get that one, but I got it. And Stoffel should be in that Red Bull, in my opinion, says Robe. I completely agree. Stoffel Van Dorn all day long. And I did have a super chat from Elijah. Thank you very much, mate, for your support. Says, I think it only puts pressure on Perez if Ricciardo outperforms Tsunoda and Perez continues his qualifying performance and comes lower than second. Thank you very much for your super chat. Fair point. I think you made the point as well, didn't you, Laurence, that it's all right having this conversation about whether Ricciardo puts pressure on Perez, but Ricciardo has to perform first as well. If Ricciardo's not delivering and Perez isn't delivering, then it's kind of an irrelevant conversation in some ways, because they're going to have to look somewhere else, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. I think those are all really good points in the chat, actually. And yeah, it is a bit down to Daniel. And the really interesting thing, as I can't remember who said it, but somebody said, is the other drivers and whether they'll be available, a little bit further down the line. Then Red Bull also have this question of, they've got Max contracted till 2028. Now, realistically, they know that if they keep supplying him with cars as good as this year's, or even not quite as good as this year's, he's going to win championships. And it's a question of, do you really want 2 number 1 drivers and all the headaches that go with that, especially if the rivals start to close in? We saw it McLaren 2007 with Hamilton and Alonso, of course, and Kimi getting the championship at the end there. It can start to work against you. Almost like the best situation is to have a driver who is going to go out and win all the races, and then another driver who is good enough to be a 10th or so off, pick up the second places, pick up the wins when your number 1 driver isn't up there for whatever reason, mechanical issues or, bad luck or getting taken out or whatever. And so I think they want Checo to be there. Now, Checo at the moment is not there. I'm not saying he is in that position, but I think he's got the ability within him to get there. So if he can get himself back there, like you said, by the end of the season, we're all quite fickle in F1. So we'll quickly forget a series of bad results if he finishes the year with, a series of second places, perhaps he'll win as well. Because that's ultimately what Red Bull want. I'm not sure they really want, if they put Leclerc in the same car, very interesting. Certainly on Saturdays, I think Max would definitely have the edge in races, but on a Saturday, I think it could be fascinating to see how close Leclerc could run Max, given how good he is over one lap. And then Lando Norris as well. He is a driver that consistently gets linked to Red Bull, and I think they've both admitted, both Christian and Lando, that they've had the odd chat in the past. But it's never quite come together. But yeah, both those drivers, Lando, we've seen a bit of a resurgence from McLaren this year, but if you're looking long term and you look at, the way regulations are going in 2026, well, McLaren are going to be a customers team still then against an awful lot of works teams. So maybe he will be looking longer term what his options are. And then also Leclerc, even though at the moment he says he is committed to Ferrari long term, every time we ask him about contract talks, it's like, oh no, we haven't started that. There doesn't seem any rush from Leclerc's side to get into contract talks. I know he's got another year, but Carlos meanwhile seems very keen to start having the contract talks. And I think that just shows you that Leclerc's got the confidence there that if another option did come along, then he might be interested in what's on the table. But we're still a bit of a way out from there, aren't we? But I think a lot, as you say, will depend on this second half of the year. What Daniel can do, what Checo can do, and it's a nice subplot to have as a journalist, because otherwise, I think I'm running out of ways of describing brilliant Max Verstappen victories, as brilliant as they are. When he keeps winning by 20 seconds, it does get hard to make it entertaining.
Yeah, when I do the streams on a Sunday after the race now, it's sort of the bit about Verstappen and Red Bull is getting shorter and shorter, because he's sort of like, there's only so many ways I could say unbelievable, what a performance, wow, Max has won, before it starts getting a little bit repetitive. So I mean, all credit to them, absolutely unreal. People keep saying the season's boring. I don't agree. It's predictable in who's going to win it. I get that, but there's been so much going on behind. But I still can't believe we're essentially, Hungary next weekend is the halfway stage of the season. It doesn't feel that long since Bahrain, so it must be going relatively well. A couple more comments from chat, and I'm going to throw a question at everybody because I'm really intrigued. So brace yourself, Laurence. I love putting people on the spot on these streams, so apologies in advance. The final meow down, I can't even say that, says, if Marco gets his way with the sister team, they may swap Sergio Perez and Daniel Ricciardo. Sergio Perez, proven leader, uber experienced, great mentor. Daniel Ricciardo has good chemistry with Max. Sergio Perez doesn't, regardless of Horner's PR lies. Thank you very much. People lying to the media, I'm not having it. It's not true. And I did see another point, and I can't remember who. I think it was Ken Charlotte said it. You're only as good as your last race, which is such a great line. It really, really is, because it's so true, isn't it? It's a lot of sports, you're only as good as your last performance. If it's a bad one, then people are going to be speculating about your future and talking about whether you're good enough. But you keep performing, you remove that one. So I'll end this poll as well before I ask the question. I asked at the start, does Daniel Ricciardo's return put pressure on Sergio Perez? 84% said yes. 8% said no, 6% unsure, which means several percent have gone missing according to YouTube. But hey, that's a unique way they work it out. So 84% say yes, it does. So there you go. Thank you very much for your votes on that one. So the question...
Surprised that's not higher, actually. I'm surprised that's not higher. Yeah, I can't see in any world that it doesn't add pressure. It doesn't mean that Daniel's going to take his seat next year, but it definitely adds pressure, doesn't it? There's no way you can cut it and say that it doesn't. Certainly compared to the position we were in, where it was Yuki and Nyck De Vries. I think having Daniel in that position, and having heard Daniel say on the record that he, is playing up and wants, ultimately a Red Bull drive, of course that puts pressure on Checo. So, I agree with the vast majority, of course, but I'm just surprised the reasons the other people would say, oh, no, actually, it doesn't put any extra pressure on.
Yinka says the only reason I believe this season isn't boring is because Sean keeps saying it. This reminds me so much of 2004, and I was a Schumacher fan, and I loved that. So there you go. I said it on Sunday again. 12 out of 13 races he won, and I think he DNF from the one that he didn't win. Absolutely dominated that season. So it happens in Formula One, and sometimes I think you have to pick your battles. If you're only watching F1 for who wins and who's going to win the title, then yeah, it probably is a little bit dull. But I mean, look at Silverstone at the weekend. How much fun was that with the McLarens being up there? And we've seen some fantastic racing in behind, and the battle's fascinating. The development fight with the teams at the back is really interesting as well. So I can't ever say I accept there are dull races and races where not a lot happens, but I would never say things are boring, because I think there's always something to look for in Formula One. But I'm going to ask that question now. So chat, pop your lineups in the chat. Who will be at Red Bull in? Well, let's go next season. Why not? It's closer than 25. Who will be there in 2024? Will it be Verstappen and Perez? Or will it be Verstappen and Ricciardo? Or Verstappen and Norris? Or Verstappen and, I don't know, Vettel? What do you think, Laurence? Verstappen and Vettel could be fun. That just came into my brain out of nowhere.
That would be great. Yeah. Did you see that he was at the tyre test yesterday? He was driving
Ricciardo's
a 93 Senna car randomly on the same day. And then, went to say hello to Daniel, which I thought was very sweet. Of course, former teammates, and they got on quite well.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, I'd love to see Verstappen Vettel. I think it wouldn't go well for Vettel, if I'm honest, certainly after a couple of years out. So wait, we're talking about 2024 next year, are we? Or we're talking about 25?
Yeah, you can say 25 as well, but I was going to go with 24 because it's a bit closer.
So 24, I feel like we're going to still have Verstappen and Checo. No, that's a boring answer. And I'd say it with no certainty either. That really is just taking a guess. I just like, will Daniel do enough at AlphaTauri to make the difference? Don't know. I feel like even he might benefit from an extra year. 2025, that gets very interesting, because not only will Daniel either be in a position where he's very clearly ready to go back up that kind of role, but also, you've got a few contracts ending around the place. So, and I'm even more uncertain who it's going to be, but then I don't think it will be Checo.
Interesting. I was looking at the chat. There's Nomad's gone absolutely crazy in chat. Says Red Bull's lineup next year will be Leclerc and Norris.
I mean, that I would be interesting to see. I mean, Max keeps talking about how that he's not that keen on the calendar expanding and the addition of sprint races. I don't think he's seriously considering quitting quite yet, but that's another interesting thing. We have to play in and factor in is how much longer does Max want to continue on? And I think he'll see the end of his 28. His contract that goes to 28. After that, he's dropped a hint a couple of times already that actually, I've got other things to do in my life. A series to race in. I think he's very keen to race in on and try out a few different disciplines as well. So anyway, next year, look, Max is there for some time, as far as I'm concerned. Not least because I think he still gets a massive kick out of winning championships, even if he has to turn up 24 times a year to do it.
It's such a chore.
It is. Imagine 24 opportunities to drive a Formula One car around the best tracks in the world, and that's too much. But anyway.
Jamie, Samul, and Robbie say Max and Checo for next year. Dell says Verstappen and Ricciardo, as does Evan General Dragon. And the final, I'll just call you the final. You'll know who you are. I'm not going to try and butcher that one again. Lewis says Max and Perez, as does Jaws, Gaz and Fluffy. AJ says Verstappen and Ricciardo. Verstappen and Perez for Sabotage Designs. Devil Psychic says Verstappen and Perez. Vashek says, I think it'll be Daniel Ricciardo and Max Verstappen. Verstappen and Sonoda, says Jonathan. Interesting. Verstappen and Albon for 25, says AD. Actually, do you know what? Perfect opportunity to ask this question. I'm going to do it. I give them the credit they deserve. Stefan asked on YouTube earlier, would love to see some of your thoughts on how realistic an Albon move back into the Red Bull ecosystem is in the next year or two. Given his performances, I personally think they'll be dying to bring him back into one of the two teams. Could Albon be on the cards for 25? I kind of asked this on Sunday when somebody else asked me, because I would like to see Albon, a bit like Gasly, kind of just I don't know, cut his teeth, if you like, or whatever you want to call it, or just build his career away from Red Bull now, given what happened. But as you said earlier, if a team like that comes knocking, then it's difficult to say no. Could you see Albon back in there at any point in the future?
I could actually. It's one of the few Red Bull drivers where I could see him going back. They actually split on very good terms. Albon even carried the Red Bull logo on his helmet at Williams first year. And the relationship there with Christian is still good. Christian actually talks about Alex quite a lot sometimes after races. When Alex has these pretty impressive performances, he does make a note of it. So I could see that happening. But I think a lot of it will depend, again, just on how these next couple of year and a half develop and the performances are going. Alex is currently on this rock solid contract in Williams, which no one seems able to kind of get into. And I think, it's not at all a bad place for him to be, because especially this year, they've got a very specific car that no one really expects to be quick anywhere, but it is actually quite quick on certain circuits when the track layout is right. I don't think it's going to be very quick in Hungary for what it's worth, but yeah, certain tracks it really does excel. And also I feel like that's a team that finally is getting to the right position in terms of structure, with James Vowles at the top. I don't know if you've listened to, he did a podcast recently with Tom Clarkson, and he's, I've kind of been to a couple of events where he's been speaking, and you can't help but believe in James Vowles and his vision for that team, because whenever he talks, he seems to have it so organised and structured in his mind where it's going to go, but also realistic about how long it's going to take. So if Alex is a part of that, look, I don't think they're going to start, fighting for podiums anytime soon, but if he's a part of that recovery, I think he'll learn an awful lot from that and will become a much more mature driver as a result of it. And ultimately, I think, the thing that happened with him at Red Bull is it was just too much too soon. And Red Bull do have this tendency to do that, drop drivers in at the deep end and just see if they sink or swim. And of course, when you have Max Verstappen, it's quite easy to defend that argument, isn't it? You just say, well, look at Max. Max was able to do it. And all we need at the end of the day, if you're Red Bull, is a driver who can win championships for us. So, Verstappen has gone and done that. It was clear that Alex, during his time at Red Bull, that didn't quite click, and he struggled with confidence. But I think, now with a bit more maturity away from Red Bull, he could be a good candidate later on for a top drive.
Yeah. I think the other thing as well for me with I say this all the time, people are getting sick of me saying it, but with James Vowles is that the improvement he's made at Williams, when you consider that this isn't his car, this is a car that was already well on the way to being put together for 2023 before he even signed with them. So I'm really excited to see what he can do next season when he's had full control over everything. So I think what he's done this year is incredible. And I think the future, I'm reluctant to say it because I've said it recently about Williams before, I feel like in the last few years, but I feel like the future is really bright for that team now. And the financial situation isn't as dire as it was at one point. And I think, with all respect to him and with all the love in the world to him, Sir Frank Williams and the Williams family, they very much were quite set in their ways, whereas, Dorilton Capital seem more happy to work more closely with other teams rather than... Because Sir Frank Williams was very much like, it's a manufacturer's championship. We should be manufacturing this, that and the other. Whereas I think the owners now are more willing to work with other people a bit more. And I think that's really benefiting them. So I'm really pleased to see Williams doing well. We've been going just over an hour, Laurence. Do you need to fly off? Are you okay to answer some questions? I don't think we're going to get to talk about Silverstone and Hungary and Belgium, but...
I'm happy to carry on. While we're on the subject of Williams, I think you're right. Dorilton are happy to do that. But I think really the way Dorilton view it, they got that team very, very cheap now, under 200 million.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've had Alpine recently valued at 900 million. So at the moment, if they've got a team which just naturally, because of the way the rules have changed and the budget cap coming in and everything, it just... franchises we now talk about rather than F1 teams are worth so much more. So they've already at least doubled, undoubtedly more on their investment. And then, if over the next few years with just some careful and well-placed investment can get it up to a kind of Alpine level team, then their return is huge. And I think that's ultimately what Dorilton are probably in it for in the long term. But it was interesting also listening to James about a few things and how some of the facilities there are up to 2 decades out of date, which is remarkable, but of course he's coming from the very best of the best at Mercedes, but in terms of facilities, but yeah, that was quite shocking. So I think you're right, and I wouldn't actually attribute performance of the car to James really this year. That's not to be nasty on James. It's just, as you say, it was well underway by the time he turned up. But I think operationally they've been a lot sharper, and I think also the motivation and the whole feeling around the team is just completely different. It's almost like a completely different place to it was 12 months ago. So I think that's all very positive, and like you, I'd love to see them back at the front, or well, as close to it as they can get.
Just as they are now, back towards the midfield is great this year, and then going forward, competing for regular points would be fantastic. And I think Alex Albon's a great driver for them to build around as well if they want to do that. So it'll be the other thing I'm quite intrigued by as well. Just sort of off on a tangent a little bit. It's still about Albon, but I know he's not got the Red Bull ties officially anymore. But I do wonder if they've got like a football style buyback clause in there somewhere. If they want him, they get first refusal if Williams are going to let him go or anything like that, or I don't know. It's a bit of a weird one.
No, I've wondered the same, but he did say quite explicitly, I think at some point towards the end of last year, that he is absolutely 100% a Williams driver with no Red Bull affiliation. But I think Esteban Ocon said the same thing about being an Alpine driver. And yet, his management, if you go high and up the chain, it kind of links back towards Mercedes again. So, look, the most important thing is that the ties are there. Let's be honest, I don't think Red Bull would need a kind of first refusal thing. If Red Bull come knocking, you're probably going to go there, unless something very drastic happens at that team. But they do seem to be very well set for the next at least decade to be at the top of F1. So, yeah, I think if Alex gets a call from Luciano Helmut, then he'll answer it straight away. I don't think there'd be any question about that. But I think we're probably getting a bit ahead of ourselves with Alex's career. But it is nice to see a driver who went through such a tough period so publicly to basically get a second chance and make the most of it.
Yeah, I agree. Good stuff from Williams. Very happy to see them doing well, and McLaren as well. But what we'll do is we're not going to get to Silverstone chat too much in Hungary because we that took a long time, but it was always going to because there was so much to get through. Some great insights from Laurence as well. What we'll do then is if you've got any questions, pop them in chat. I'll read some out. Please do leave a like on the stream as well. 120 likes, just over 400 here. So please do drop a like. Really would appreciate that. Don't forget to subscribe as well. We'll do some questions for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll call it a night. Midweek streams tend to be a bit shorter as well. DJ Neckard has popped in a super chat, aka Channel OG Thomas. Thank you very much, mate, for your continued support. Been here since 2017. Goodness me, that's as long as I've been here. Says, ever considered that Max and Danny have the same driving style, while Max and Checo are the polar opposites? They would slay. I assume means Max and Danny. Also says 1 week out and we are already in Budapest. So he's there for the weekend a week early. That's what I call commitment. Thomas, very good. Max and Checo polar opposites. Daniel and Max similar driving styles. Is that something that's true? Is that something that other people have picked up on? And also, actually, it's a very good point. If they have got similar driving styles and that car, as is rumoured, and it is only a rumour, so don't take this as gospel, does lean towards Max's driving style more, then if Ricciardo's got the same driving style, then they would absolutely crush every race 1-2, wouldn't they? In theory. Right on the spot there, Laurence.
I think there's arguably more similarities. I mean, I honestly don't know for certain. If you look at the weaknesses where Daniel really struggled at McLaren, I think that was very telling. I don't think Max would have had the same issues. I really don't. So there is an element of driving style, but probably the biggest thing for the top drivers is just the adaptability, how you can drive around issues, and the rear end bouncing around, which is something that Max seems to be able to with quite well, and Checo and Daniel certainly when it's on corner entry are less keen on. So maybe because maybe Daniel is more of a corner entry like understeery issue. So possibly, but I still feel like Max of the three of those is the driver that's going to get the most out of it, no matter which way Red Bull push the development. And yeah, I think as we were talking about earlier, that can often get mistaken for Red Bull pushing it Max's way. But I think it's more just Max's able to just find ways to drive around different types of kind of intricacies of the car and still get a good lap time.
A bit of a random question and a bit of a side thing, really. Jack wants to know if he should now get another Daniel Ricciardo tattoo. That's up to you, Jack. I'm not going to say this to your body, mate, but go for it if you want to. And RRTV says, do you think McLaren will be permanently quick? As you can see, Aston is slowly going back to being midfielders. So McLaren really, I think, blew everybody away at Silverstone. And I said on Sunday, potentially controversially, that was the first time this season. Maybe there are a couple of examples you could throw in there with Alonso and Hamilton at Canada, for example. But the first time really this season that Max looked to have somebody taking the fight to him outside of his teammates. So an incredible step forward from McLaren. Do we think that's a permanent pace? I know they tend to go well in Austria and Silverstone anyway, don't they? The track does suit their car. So maybe, I don't know, speculating, update came at the right time for the right tracks and it was the perfect storm. Or do you think they can carry that on to Hungary and Belgium and be serious contenders towards the sharp end?
It's a bit of both as far as I'm concerned. So the update has definitely unlocked quite a lot of pace. I think even more performance than McLaren felt it would, which is obviously a very positive thing. But those were two tracks which suited the car. The car is very good in high-speed corners. Plenty of those at Silverstone, high density of those. And it's because of the work they've done and changes they've made, it's a fairly error-efficient car now as well. None of that is particularly useful in Hungary. So the real strengths of the car, I don't think, will make a big difference in Hungary. And I think Lando talked about this on Sunday as well, that they're going to get to Hungary and people are going to ask, what on earth have you done to the car to be so far further back down the order? Now, I don't know if it would be quite as drastic as that, but I would keep expectations in check if you're a McLaren fan. Meanwhile, I think Hungary really could suit the Aston. The Aston we know is pretty good in low and medium speed corners, so that's pretty much all of the Hungaroring. So I think what you'll see is these changes in the midfield, and also upgrades come. It's going to move around. The other key factor in McLaren's performance in Silverstone, certainly in the race, was that the conditions were relatively cool for a Formula One race. We're used to going to some of basically following the sun around all year, and at Silverstone it was relatively cool, which meant that they could keep on top of their tyre deg, which has been an issue throughout the season. And the next part of the update, the final part of this update that McLaren have been adding to their cars, basically as and when it's ready since Austria, is aimed at mitigating those tyre degradation issues. So hopefully that will mean that if it's a very hot race in Hungary, which it often is, they'll be able to deal with that a little bit better. But I think that's still a primary concern for them. It's just how they go through tyres. And I think there were other factors for the decision to go hard tyres, but under the safety car, the main factor was that they thought it was going to be a VSC, and under VSC they felt hard tyres was the right way to go because they thought it was going to be cleared up much quicker. So they got the hard tyres ready, and then when the car came in, the safety car was out by then, and they didn't really have time to swap around the tyres and make a clean pit stop. So there are a number of factors, but I think at the back of the mind also, their concerns about tyre degradation were big. But the other thing, the McLaren being very good in high speed corners with that extra grip meant that it wasn't kind of scrubbing the tyre so much in those high speed corners because it had so much downforce and grip there, which meant that they were able to hold onto the tyres a little bit better. None of that may be the case in Hungary. So I think expect it to move back and forth. And also, McLaren have just delivered this big upgrade, and we've seen that with Mercedes. After Monaco, when they got to a proper race circuit in Spain, they made a big step forward, and they've gradually been falling back. I think Aston Martin's last big upgrade was in Canada. I think I'm right in saying they had a new floor. They've kind of gradually kind of moved back since then. And of course, the two last tracks haven't really suited them. And then Alpine is another one to look out for because they've got a new floor in Spa, which they're pretty confident about, has taken a step forward. So I think, we may even see in Spa that Alpine are a contender again. And so McLaren, I think it's going to be as straightforward as, podiums for the rest of the year. I remember Fernando said that earlier this year, didn't he? He said, we're going to get podiums everywhere. And everyone was like, okay, well, if you say so. But the reality of it is that it's so tight behind Red Bull an update or a track that doesn't suit a car or a change in weather conditions mean the difference between a podium and 8th or 9th place.
Yeah, I think the feeling was as well, sort of on the Aston Martin thing, that they should be better in Hungary than they were in Silverstone in particular. So that's going to be interesting to keep an eye on. But it sounds very much like the perfect storm for McLaren in those two races in particular. But for me, the evidence that the update has worked is Piastri, Austria versus Silverstone. That, for me, is where you can see the updates clearly had a big impact at the team, which is great to see. So to kind of steal our Subu, who asked this question earlier, steal their point, could Lando have won at Silverstone on Sunday? Because he was only 4 seconds off the lead come the end. I think it was Helmut Marko said that a few more laps and Norris would have been right up there with Max. Do you think that was a realistic possibility? And how drunk would the crowd have been by the end of that one if that had happened?
It would have been fantastic, wasn't it? But no, not really. I mean, you can always say that with strategy. It's like, well, if the race was 10 laps longer, the soft tyres that were on Max's car would have fallen away and Lando's would have been better. But of course, then Red Bull would never have fitted soft tyres, at the pit stop if the race was that much longer. So, and then, perhaps tyre allocation meant they wouldn't have any option, but you would go back further in the weekend and they would have held on to tyres. So it's always a bit of a fool's errand kind of chasing those kind of things. But I think what was impressive was that Lando was able to his tyres in a window enough whilst fighting Lewis that they gave the performance that they did, and he could hold off Lewis because immediately after the safety car, I think Lando even felt it that he was going to lose that position to Lewis, and Lewis came very close. So it was perhaps as close as we've seen them get, but I think the real telltale from that race was the start of it, where Max made a bad start, which has been a little bit of a trait of his this year. If you were going to try and find a weakness in Max Verstappen's game this year, it would probably be the start. So, a bit of wheel spin, Lando got ahead, held that position for 5 laps, but Max was so measured, he just let his tyres get in the right temperature window, DRS came on, he had a fairly straightforward pass. Lando stuck with him for a little while, held a bit of DRS for a couple of laps. Then again, that was Max just letting his tyres get back into a position where they were, optimum for the strategy they had planned. Then I think before the safety car, he had a lead of about 9 seconds. So I think that's the more realistic difference in performance. But considering where we've been at some races this year, 9 seconds after half a race, maybe not too bad. And also, given what happened at the end, it would have been interesting if they'd all been. Well, it wouldn't have been as an exciting race, but might have been interesting from a purely comparative point of view to see what would happen without the safety car as well.
We'll take 2 or 3 more then. Sorry, Laurence.
Go for it. Yeah, no, please do.
Tremus and AD are kind of asking the same question. Now De Vries is gone, which drivers are most under pressure besides Perez? Magnussen, Stroll are 2 examples they put forward. And AD says as well, Sargent, ? I did actually make a point or wrote something down about Sargent. A lot of people asking about his future since this news came for De Vries. A lot of people saying, De Vries wasn't as bad as Sargent, but, you're comparing 2 different drivers, 2 different teams, 2 different ages and experience and all of that. But the word from Williams at the weekend was that they are happy with the progress that Logan Sargent is making. So I don't necessarily think he's under pressure. Maybe from the outside looking in, people might think that. But who do you think is the next one, not on the chopping block as such, but the next one who maybe needs to just up the game a little bit, who's under a bit of pressure from probably more people like me and the people in chat than maybe their team, but you know the point.
Yeah, so I think there's a bit of pressure on Logan, but I think he's kind of, it's not been spectacular, but it's not been terrible as well. And it's been a big step up on Latifi. And I think the thing that actually Nick will be kicking himself about is that Williams was probably on the table for him last year as an option, after that Monza result. Because at that point, Logan, it wasn't clear whether he'd have the super license points. And so if a deal had been done, fairly quickly and Logan had been given another year in F2 or whatever, then that obviously would have that Nick's still in F1 right now, which he's not. So I wonder how much he's looking back at that decision and worrying about it. But look, I don't think any other team is in a position where they've got a driver they can bring in to replace anyone this year. So I don't think anyone else is in a Nyck De Vries situation. Of course, for next year, there's a number of drivers which perhaps could be doing slightly better. Lance Stroll is undoubtedly one of those, but he has the unique advantage of having a father who owns the Formula One team. So I can't really see him.
I love that.
see him getting booted either. So yeah, it's a tricky one. Kevin's an interesting, because Kevin Magnussen was one of the drivers that was mentioned right in the question. So
yeah,
I feel like he's had a bit of a wake up call this year, because last year he looked pretty good against Mick, although towards the end of the year, I think it seemed like, with the exception of the pole position in Brazil, he kind of not been as motivated as he had been at the start of the year. But yeah, Kevin's an interesting one, because Nico's come in there and in qualifying, and obviously in the race we know the issues that the Haas has. It just goes backwards. It has awful tyre deg. They can't really race unless something unusual happens or strategy goes their way, or it's very low deg track. So so I think Kevin perhaps maybe feeling a little bit of the pressure, but he's very close to Gunther. So I feel like he can probably weather the storm a bit, and I think he is talented enough to secure that seat for another year.
You've kind of answered Vashek's question as well there with the Stroll thing. So it's a bit off topic, but do you think Lance Stroll will lose his seat because Stroll Senior loses his patience with him underperforming? So I think you've kind of answered that, Laurence, and probably not. I think actually he was like, no.
It would be a big surprise, definitely. And again, you have to have someone who can replace him. I mean, I'd like to see what Felipe Drugovich can do, but would he come in and actually do a better job than Lance? I don't know. I think that's pretty debatable. And then you've got to look at who else is available, driver-wise, and where they'd be. And I think if you pick apart Lance's early season, there were a few reasons and a few things that went slightly wrong for him. I mean, it's a bit the same as trying to make excuses for Checo. Really, he should have been delivering the laps when the opportunities were there. But you can start to make some arguments. And of course, he didn't start the season particularly well either, with the broken wrist and missing testing and driving in a very uncomfortable situation early on. So I'm almost certain he'll still be there next year, just given the situation of that team.
Okay, one more, and this is a question that I have. I know Red Raven's had it for a while. Stuart, who used to do the streams quite often with me, we've all kind of at the same point with this. What is the buzz around Haas? Everyone else is moving. They seem to be frozen in their ways at the bottom of the standings, yet nothing happens. What's the deal there? I always feel like, you look at some teams and you can see what they want to do and you can understand why they're there in Formula One. Whereas Haas, I never really, and it sounds terrible, I never really get what they are. I mean, they're a racing team, but you know what I mean? I never really get where they want to go or what their ambition is. They've got these nice ties to Ferrari, but what is that ambition? Why are they not making the big strides that other teams do? I mean, they're literally writing seasons off to build a better car, and then never really. I mean, they did well at the start of last year, but it's not really. They've not really built from that. Is it a financial thing? I mean, Gene Haas is pretty well off, isn't he?
Yeah, I don't think it is a financial thing anymore, because they got the MoneyGram partnership, and and that brings them up to the cost cap. So it's a much more. It's a deeper thing with Haas, because Haas are a unique Formula One team, that they don't construct their own chassis or most of their parts. They take the maximum amount as is allowed from Ferrari, and their design office is based in Maranello. It's not. They don't have a kind of. They do have a base in Banbury in the UK, but they don't have a base like other midfield teams, and that's all well and good. But there's a number of issues there. One, you're very much tied to Ferrari, because suspension, rear suspension, gearbox, engine, the whole rear end of the car is based around Ferrari. And once you do that, you're very pinned into the Ferrari concept of how you build the car. The other thing is that, and I think this has been a trait of Haas, is that they can start seasons very well. But then bringing updates to the car is a bit harder, because unlike the midfield team, so I'm thinking of Alpine, Aston Martin and so on, let's say it takes them to 10 weeks, probably 8 weeks to go from having an idea about a brand new floor, through design, CFD, wind tunnel, and constructing it, and getting it ready to go on the car. The lead time will be much longer because they will have to go to Dallara, make sure that their kind of time is booked in with Dallara to build the floor and bring it to the car. So I think in terms of updates, we tend to see fewer on the Haas and perhaps more in big chunks. And so, I think that is a limiting factor when you're up against such competitive teams. And there's a lot of talk at the moment in Formula One about capital expenditure and what you're allowed to do under the budget cap. And there's a lot of teams which want that to be freed up so that they can basically improve their facilities. Aston Martin did the right thing from a competitive point of view, which is to do all their capital expenditure just before the CapEx budget cap came in, which is why they have this beautiful new glistening factory outside Silverstone, which is incredibly impressive. And they have lines of brand new machines in there for constructing stuff. And, so it's, and I think that's a big difference that can sometimes be overlooked, is just that ability, that nimbleness to go from idea to getting it on the car. And it's something which maybe Haas is slightly lacking compared to its rivals. And that's not to say that the Haas system, it can't work or it doesn't work. It's just, it is a very competitive sport. And if you have a slight disadvantage, then that'll work against you. Now, I think the other thing specific to this year is that we've seen on both Haas and Ferrari that tyre degradation is a massive issue. So we often see them qualify quite well. They can get the tyres in a window for one lap. Great lap, Hulkenberg in Q3, we've seen it a number of times. Fantastic, but in the race, they tend to go backwards. And I think my suspicion is that because Haas are tied into the whole Ferrari suspension geometry, but several steps behind in terms of what they're doing to kind of get around that, that is a limiting factor as well. So really, with Haas, they need Ferrari to come up with, probably a better overall car concept, which they may well do for next year, but then also be able to adapt in time, get enough of those plans early enough in advance to do their own job around it as well. So it is tough. It is tough. I think there was a time when the Haas model quite well, it had potential, but I think, some of its weaknesses are really being shown now, especially because so much of the performance comes from the underfloor of this car. So you'll notice when big updates come to cars, we see updates all the time on these cars, but when it's a big one, it usually involves a change to the floor. Teams will probably go for about maybe four different floor iterations, maybe 5 during a season. If you can only do 3, then you quite quickly start falling behind.
That's all interesting. It's just I've always wondered with Haas, so it's interesting to get that insight there. So thank you very much for that, Laurence. It's I'd like to see them do really well. Haas, I quite like them. I think that's partly because of a guest who used to be on the channel. Dan was a big Grosjean and Haas fan, so I think it's rubbed off on me a bit too much. But I'd like to see them do well, so hopefully they can. It's weird in the race, they just fall away. It's frustrating because I think Hulkenberg, he didn't start in the front row, but he qualified there, didn't he, at one point in this season? So you think, get that race pace right, maybe you get some more points. So
I completely agree. They're a really, really likable team. I think they're Gunter at the head of it all. Is one of the best team bosses, and also has that self-deprecating humour, which doesn't always translate in Formula One. Across the grid. So yeah, they're a fantastic team to get behind. But I do wonder, whether the model is going to work long term. The other way to look at it is the value of the entry, as we've talked about already on this podcast, is getting worth more and more. And the value of that entry is high. So it will be interesting to see if, say, FIA and F1 don't introduce an 11th team, how big the offers are to Haas to go in that way, and whether Gene would have his head turned. I honestly don't know. Every time that's been suggested, Gene's battered it away and continued with the team, and at times invested his own money, at times said, actually there's a limit to how much of my own money I'm willing to invest. But it will be interesting to see how big those numbers can go, especially if we don't get an 11th team approved through the normal process, and whether that will ultimately change Gene's mind on it. But I honestly don't know on that. It's just speculation from my side.
It's maybe a bit cliche, but everybody has their price, don't they?
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm sure he would if the offer was right. But yes, thank you very much, Laurence. We'll leave it there, mate, because we've been going a little while now. I could waffle all night and chat to you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And are you in Hungary and Belgium as well?
I am, yeah. I'm going to Hungary on Wednesday. One of the listeners was, it's already there, right? And Budapest. Yeah. Anyone who's looking to do a European race, if you can get some cheap Wizz Air flights or Ryanair flights down to Budapest, it's a fairly cost-effective place to stay and a lot of fun. You can go from the city to the track each day. And I remember when I first started in F1, I was never that taken by Budapest because on TV it never seemed like brilliant race. It kind of went through that period of having quite a lot of dull races. Going there, and I think increasingly, for whatever reason, the cars have kind of grown into the circuit a bit almost, even though it is a very tight circuit. But I just feel like we get consistently quite good races there and occasionally mixed weather as well. So yeah, going to Budapest, and then I'm taking a train, overnight train, to get myself up to Spa. So I'm trying to stay away from flights as much as possible. And then I get a much-deserved summer break. Or at least I think it's much-deserved. Probably not, but yeah.
Before the chaos of the second half of the season.
and the second half season is chaotic just because of the flying we're doing. To get around, Singapore, Japan, then Austin, Mexico, Brazil triple header, then Las Vegas and Abu Dhabi. It's pretty wild, and it's only going to get worse next year, I think. But anyway, so be it.
Definitely a well-earned break then. But yeah, thank you very much, Laurence. I will mute myself now and go and do my sign-off, and I'll be back with you in just a second. So thank you very much, mate. It's been a pleasure chatting to you, and I think the chat enjoyed it as well. So win-win.
Thanks, Sean. It was really good fun. Yeah.
Thank you very much to Laurence. Thank you as well to everyone for tuning in. Pleasure as always. I love these midweek streams. It's always nice when we can get somebody on who's got boots on the ground and a bit more information than just me sat here speculating for an hour and a half, as I do sometimes. It's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you all. Please do leave a like on the stream before you go. 300 of you still here, 350 of you still here, 150 likes. Let's get that as high as we can, so thank you so much. Please do subscribe as well. Thank you for your support on yesterday's video. Channel's actually showed some growth for the first time in ages, so I really do appreciate that one, and for your continued support. Now, I will be back. As I said on Sunday, my partner is off this week, so I might now take a few days to make the effort and spend some time together, that kind of stuff, grown-up stuff. But I will definitely be back next week with the Hungarian Grand Prix preview, another back-to-back, and of course then we've got Spa. We'll do the post-quali waffles as well, and the race reaction, and I think after Spa F1 Manager releases, so we'll do some F1 Manager streams as well, so looking forward to that. But as ever, thank you for watching. I've been Sean, this has been the F1 Word, and until next time, goodbye. Cheers, big ears, to you too, Moray. Love it.